Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar, Usage and Benefits of the Vienna Test System in Sport. My name is David Brieber and I will guide you through this webinar today. If you have any questions in between, I would like to ask you to use the questions toolbox in your GoToWebinar tool. I will be glad to respond to these questions at the end of our webinar. So, what do we have planned for today? Essentially, there are two parts. On the one hand, I want to show you the current state of research on the topic of cognitive skills in sports and to what extent the Vienna Test System is already being used in this context. And in the second part, I want to show you in which fields of applications VTS can be used and what are the advantages of digital tests also in this context. So let's start with the sport psychological part. So generally, cognitive skills are an important factor in sports. We all know that just about any sport activity requires a complex interplay of attentional, psychomotor, and perceptual processes. And these cognitive skills are not only basic requirements for participating in sports, no, they are strongly associated with the level of performance in a certain sport. So in sports psychological research, we basically differentiate between two approaches to examine differences in cognitive abilities between elite and amateur athletes. So on the one hand, we have the so-called expert performance approach, which uses sport-specific tasks to examine this question. And on the other hand, we have the so-called cognitive component skill approach, which uses domain independent, so sport unspecific task to do sport psychological research. VTS Sport is clearly useful for the second approach, as all VTS tests measure basic cognitive skills using sport unspecific test material. And measuring these basic cognitive skills makes sense because there is nowadays ample of evidence that elite and amateur athletes differ also with regards to this basic cognitive abilities. There are essentially three overarching functional areas in which elite and amateur athletes differ: visual attention, visual perception, and executive function. In the attention area, of course, we know that sports is complex and a highly dynamic activity, and accurate and fast responses are important and therefore require a high level of attention. We also know that the top athletes are good at focusing on relevant aspects and ignoring irrelevant aspects, that they are generally show fast and more accurate responses and are also more flexible in adjusting the size of the focus of attention. And we also have meta-analytical evidence which suggests that top athletes have a superior ability to perceive and respond to environmental stimuli in a quickly and accurate fashion. Next to the attentional area, when it comes to visual perception, in terms of visual acuity and depth perception, there are no differences between elite and amateur athletes. However, the vertical and horizontal field of view are larger and in elite athletes, and there is also more focused gaze behavior, which allows a generally greater information intake in elite players. And besides attention and perceptual function, there are so-called executive functions, which are basically higher cognitive functions that are always relevant when your mind cannot switch to autopilot. Yeah? And the main executive functions are working memory, inhibition, and cognitive flexibility. For inhibition and cognitive flexibility, there is evidence that elite athletes perform better than amateurs, and moreover, there is also some evidence that such kind of executive functional performance is related to the number of goals and assists in future soccer games. So they have some kind of predictive validity also. In general, then it can be said that elite athletes also differ from amateurs in their basic cognitive abilities. And if one combines all of these separate single studies and to examine especially only those studies which use sport-unspecific tasks, as we can see in this meta-analysis by Scharfen and Mehmet, then this kind of analysis shows that there are these kind of higher cognitive functions, basic cognitive functions in elite athletes. Consequently, the tests of the Vienna Test System are actually ideally suited for sports psychological research, since they can precisely capture and measure those basic cognitive abilities in a sport-unspecific and very differentiated manner. The versatility and the usefulness of the VTS has been confirmed in a separate review paper published by an author which is actually entirely independent of Schufried in a prestigious sport psychological journal, International Review of Sport and Exercise Psychology. And in this paper, the author also concludes that VTS is a valuable tool which can provide researchers as well as people who are working in applied settings with valuable information. And here is just an overview of a selection of authors and papers which have used the Vienna Test System for their research. And as you can see here in this selection of papers, VTS is used and relevant for many different types of sports. Let me now move from sports psychological research to more applied settings, to the applied sports psychology. Generally, we see that there are in the context of applied sports psychology, the question is, where can I use psychological tests and how will I benefit from using these kind of tests? And basically all trainers, coaches have the same challenges, I would say. So there are questions about what are the strengths and weaknesses of my player, which position best suits which athlete, which training method is most effective, under which circumstances can an athlete perform at his or her best. So exactly for these kind of questions, sports psychological examinations or sports psychological testing can be helpful. And specifically, there are three areas, three fields of applications for which psychological testing may be relevant. On the one hand, it's about finding new and young talents. So the assessment of talent is a central task in children and youth sports. Specifically for this area of application, VTS Sport has a specific test set, which is called T18-2, and where for which the test material and the duration is specifically tailored to teenagers and adolescents, and the results also include a profile for strengths and weaknesses as well as an overall measure. I will show you more information on this test set in a moment. Aside from youth sports, the assessment of cognitive strengths and weaknesses is of course also relevant for other age groups, and because it can serve as an additional basis for how to plan training and how to do a certain selection of players. And then in general, psychological tests can also be used for the preparation, for the support and the evaluation of the training process itself. So in addition to this more cognitive aspects, of course, also personality traits also play a role in sports, which can also be objectively measured by psychological questionnaires. So some of this information can be perhaps also collected when you use less standardized methods and instruments. However, digital psychological tests have a few significant advantages here. Let me just briefly explain them. So on the one hand, the digital tests from the Vienna Test System are objective. So they're highly standardized in terms of test administration and the scoring procedure. So the results that you get out of the Vienna Test System are consequently independent of who's actually supervising and administering the test. Tests of the Vienna Test System are also reliable, so they are accurate and precise, and this is what you want if you want to do measures, especially with test persons which had also a high level of performance. And of course, all of these tests that you have in the Vienna Test System, these digital psychometric tests, measure the dimensions that they are supposed to be measuring, so they are valid, and they measure cognitive abilities which are relevant for various sports, as I've shown you before, and they can also differentiate between amateurs and elite or professional athletes. What we also should not forget is how do the players respond to this kind of digital testing? And our experience is that the acceptance of these digital tests is very good, and yeah, most of the athletes are very happy to work on these kind of tests. And last but not least, especially if you compare psychological tests to other measurement methods and instruments, it's very clear that it's rather inexpensive, so it has a good cost-benefit ratio. So now let's go into more detail about VTS Sport. VTS Sport basically is a software tool which allows you to define and do a specification of multiple tests in one test session by using this general user interface here. The test system allows you to work with your data, to create and combine your own test batteries, and you can also test whole teams at once in group testing settings. The evaluation is fast, objective, and optimized, and many tests are also actually available in multiple languages. So if you have players with different mother tongues, you can take this into account and and present the test in the language of which fits best to the person. The advantage of the system is, on the one hand, you have full flexibility because you can choose a single test and create your own test batteries as you need it for specific purposes. But VTS also contains this, I would say, ready-made solutions, so-called test sets, which are basically predefined test batteries that have been created by Schufried. And currently, we have two of these test sets in the area of sports, which are called SF Team and T18s2. Let me just give you a brief overview over these two test sets. As already mentioned, a T18s2 is a test set that's ideally for talent management. So when you are want to test children, young people from the age of 11, it can be used to measure relevant psychological dimensions such as reactive stress tolerance, focused attention, logical reasoning, reaction ability, visual perception, and to ensure that reaction times are measured accurately. Some tests also require a special response panel and these foot pedals here. The scoring of these test sets has a few advantages. One is that the results of each of these single tests that you have seen before, the last slide, is actually here presented in one overall evaluation. So for each dimension, you have the information whether or how the test person actually performed compared to the comparison group. And in addition to this, you also have this traffic light system, which gives you a very quick overview of whether the person is in any of these specific dimensions in a critical range. And besides this specific analysis of specific dimensions, you also get an overall rating, so a fit value, which indicates how well young athletes fit to the ideal profile. And of course, this fit value, fit score can also be easily used to compare different athletes with one another. And the test results are not only presented in such a table format, but you also have a graphical presentation of the results with this kind of strengths and weaknesses profile. SF Team has similar tests, so also reactive stress tolerance, focused attention, reaction ability, visual perception, but it also contains other psychological dimensions such as movement, anticipation, short-term memory, information processing speed, inhibition, and next to the cognitive aspect, also personality dimensions such as discipline, ambition, and sense of duty. Of course, all of them are relevant personality dimensions for sport. SF Team, as the name already suggests, is specifically designed for team sports. So you also get specific fit values for certain playing positions, and it can be used from the age of 16 years. So these were the test sets, and with regards to the single test, you have really, as I said, full flexibility because we have a broad range of tests which measuring all of the relevant functions that you are looking for when you want to do such kind of a sports psychological evaluation. A cannot go into detail now into every test, but just to give you an overview. So we have a lot of tests with regards to attention, other cognitive functions that you've already seen now in the test sets as well, but also more tests with regards to reaction behavior, visual perception, sensory, motor functions. So all of these subtests are you have the possibility to combine them however you want to, and yeah, create your own test batteries for your purpose. So let me summarize this for you. So I wanted to show you that cognitive skills, cognitive abilities are important for expertise in sports. We see that elite and amateur athletes differ in several basic cognitive abilities, particularly visual perception, attention, and executive functions. VTS is in this with this regard a very versatile and useful testing instrument, on the one hand for sports psychological research, but of course also for the applied settings, and you can use it for different types of sports. In the applied field, you can use VTS sports for talent management. You can create your own status and progress assessment of cognitive strengths and weaknesses. VTS sport contains digital psychometric tests which are objective, reliable, and valid. And you cannot only test cognitive abilities, but you also can test sport-related personality traits which might be relevant in this context.